Well, good evening and welcome. Welcome to the new calendar year. The Gresham year doesn't follow the calendar year, as many of you will know, but follows the academic calendar. So this is the third of my 6 lectures this academic year. And now we embark on theatre as a genre. Well, we've been listening and watching some traditional Norwegian folk music to set the scene, and to some extent to set the scene against which Ibsen rebelled. And at the end of my lecture, we'll hear some striking modern take on traditional Norwegian music, which I think Ibsen would have liked, but of course that's pure conjecture. So I'd like to start with 2 quotations from Ibsen. The first is, "My call is not to answer," and the other is, "I do but ask." Now, these famous quotations will guide our exploration of Ibsen's play A Doll's House this evening. It's a 3-act play, and it's full of ambiguities. It asks questions. It doesn't provide answers. Its first performance was at the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen, then known as Christiania. No, I beg your pardon, that was Oslo. It was known as Copenhagen, in Denmark on the 21st of December, 1879. And if anyone has seen a performance of this play without reading the notes and without having any idea of when it was written, I think it would come as a great surprise that it was written as early as 1879. It's often considered a feminist play, as Nora, who is the protagonist and heroine, leaves her husband and her children in the closing scene of the play, intent on self-discovery. But Ibsen denied any conscious attempt to provide propaganda for the women's rights movement. And in 1898, he addressed the Norwegian Association for Women's Rights in Christiania, now Oslo. And there he delivered a kind of manifesto. And I think something of Ibsen's blunt, or at least direct manner, comes across in this quotation. "I have never written a poem or a play to further a social purpose. I have been more a poet and less of a social philosopher than most people seem inclined to believe. I thank you for your good wishes, but I must decline the honor of being said to have worked for the women's rights movement." And then listen to this. "I'm not even very sure what women's rights really are." Ibsen was interested in human beings, simply and dramatically. As a Norwegian writer, Ibsen's work was disseminated via German, and the conclusion of the play found disfavor in the German theatre world. And under great pressure, and very reluctantly, Ibsen wrote an alternative conciliatory ending in which Nora is persuaded by her husband to take one last look at her children and then loses her nerve and decides to stay. And in a letter to a Copenhagen newspaper in 1880, Ibsen referred to this alternative ending as a barbaric outrage. Now, at this point, there was no agreement between Norway and Germany, and that meant that his play could be translated from the Norwegian into the German, and all kinds of barbaric horrors could be committed by the translators and the company putting the play on. And it was for this reason that Ibsen decided to commit the barbaric outrage himself, rather than allowing someone else to commit it. The moving force really behind the change in the ending was a prima donna actress, Hedvig Raber, who refused to perform the part of Nora unless the ending was changed. Now, James McFarlane, in his introduction to the Penguin translation of the play, which is the one I would recommend, writes that Ibsen, and I quote, gave impetus to that line of development in modern European drama for which the oblique, the implied, the subdued, the elusive, the symbolic are of the essence. And that ties in with those opening quotations by Ibsen, that he only seeks to raise questions, he doesn't seek to answer. And so this evening I want to explore the play rather than explain it, and I also want to raise various questions about the nature of theatre. In earlier lectures, we've explored the genre of the novel and of poetry, and I now want to move on to 4 plays this evening's, and then in 3 subsequent lectures, we'll be looking at Anton Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and finally Tom Stoppard's The Real Thing. Now, I've included the idea of individualism in the title to this evening's lecture because insofar as Ibsen ever provided a clue to his intentions, he simply described his concern to provide, and I quote, a description of humanity. A description of humanity. Well, that's a very broad aim. How many artists are there in any medium who would say that they were doing anything other than describing humanity? And in this play, this abstract notion of humanity is described through individuals, and in particular, the confrontation of 2 individuals, those 2 in the marriage, Torvald and Nora Helmer, and they have irreconcilable visions of life, and that's wherein the drama lies. And at the climax of the play, in an exchange between husband and wife, Helmer declares, this is Torvald, the husband, "First and foremost, you are a wife and mother." And Nora replies, "That I don't believe anymore. I believe that first and foremost, I am an individual, just as you are, or at least I'm going to try to be." Now, before we move on to the play, I just want to provide a little bit of context for it. Ibsen's creative life almost exactly spanned the second half of the 19th century. His first Prentice drama was published in 1850, and his very last piece was published in 1899, so 1 year short of 50 years, the second half of the 19th century, was when Ibsen was active. But it was only during the last quarter of the 19th century that he wrote the dramas which were to transform modern European theatre, the 12 so-called dramas of contemporary life, of which A Doll's House of 1879 is one. And it was this play and its companion piece, Ghosts of 1881, that made Ibsen's name internationally. Ibsen was born in a small logging town in southern Norway in 1828, Skien. And his father was a respected general merchant, and they were really very wealthy, in fact, amongst the wealthiest in the town. This was their house. But in 1836, his business went bankrupt, and the family was disgraced. They continued to live in comparative wealth, but their status within the community fell and never really recovered. His father became very melancholic and grumpy, and his mother, who was deeply devout, became increasingly withdrawn. So Henrik left school and left home as soon as he could. At the age of 15, he moved to Grimstad, a small hamlet 70 miles south, and there he found a job as an apothecary's apprentice, and he started studying to gain admission to university. But he was already bitten by theatre, and in response to his study of Latin, he wrote his first play, Catalina, in 1850. He moved to Christiania, now Oslo, and continued his studies. But the theatre had really bitten. And remarkably, he was appointed director and playwright to a new theatre in Bergen. And this is when the Norwegians were trying to establish a nationalist theatre. It was an extraordinarily lucky break, and in addition to being charged to produce plays, he was also charged with writing a new play on an annual basis. But this was very much with a view to establishing a national drama. Now, the idea of a nationalist drama was completely antipathetic to Ibsen's nascent ideas about what theatre could do. What Ibsen was interested in, and I think this is in part because of what the family went through and his mother's very dogmatic faith, he was interested in the way theatre could explore individuals' dramas and dilemmas, rather than providing answers. And of course, a national theatre, by definition, would have to be a theatre of the people as opposed to of individuals. It would have to be polemical. It would have to encourage a national identity, loyalty, a national way of seeing things. And all these things were really the obverse of what Ibsen wanted to explore. So in addition to the kind of clash between his own interest in theatre and this idea of a nationalist theatre, he was working with Danish theatre, which at the time was a mix of old Icelandic sagas and sort of salon theatre borrowed from France, which was supposed to be entertaining and have a happy ending. So it was an extraordinary mishmash, and this was really the only tradition that Ibsen could tap into. So all in all, this appointment was immensely demanding. He moved from Bergen to Christiania from 1857 to 1862, and he experimented with various different kinds of theatrical endeavour. He was unhappy with most of them, as indeed were his critics and his audiences. In 1858, that's the theatre in Christiania, where he was based. And then in 1858, he married Susanna Torsen, and this marked something of a turning point. She was very widely read, she was committed to the arts, and she gave Ibsen new confidence. He started to write with new energy and greater control. Love's Comedy of 1862, which is a satire on romantic illusions, shows some of the mature Ibsen's anti-idealism and skepticism. But commercially, it was a disaster. It was universally slated by the public and the critics. And it was only really when he took some of his own critical ideas about contemporary society and the petty-mindedness of Norway to an extreme that he achieved first notoriety and then real critical success. And that play was A Doll's House. And society here, so the contemporary society, about which he was critical, is represented by a family and a number of outsiders who disturb the precarious sort of happy family made up of Torvald, Helmer, his wife Nora, and 3 small children. Torvald is about to become a bank manager. He's also keeper of the family's finances and of family morals. No debts, never borrow, we hear him tell Nora firmly at the very beginning of the play. And the degree to which Nora feels oppressed by her husband's standards comes across when she says at one point, "I would simply love to say damn." Now, I think to a modern audience, there's a degree of humour in that, but I think it's evidence of Nora's extraordinary naivety. She isn't really aware of just how oppressed she is, and this desire to say damn is as far as she gets to recognising her sense of frustration and repression. And Torvald is father not only to the 3 children, but also to some extent to Nora, whom he calls his skylark, his squirrel, my precious little singing bird, his pet, whom he describes early on as expensive for a man to keep, which is a telling expression. Nora's only childish rebellion until the very end of the play is to buy macaroons, which Torvald has banned, and we'll see this in a clip in a moment. Now, this stable but oppressive order is disturbed by a number of greedy individuals, or one greedy individual and another self-seeking individual, and one of them threatens to expose an illegal act that Nora has unknowingly committed in order to borrow money to travel abroad for the sake of Torvald's health, and all this has taken place before the play opens. Nora, we learn, has been advised by their doctor that Torvald has overworked and is exhausted, and for the sake of his health, he needs to spend time resting in a warm climate. And so they've been and spent a year in Italy. The trip, of course, was expensive, and Nora tells her husband that the funds for this trip have been given to them by her father. In fact, she's borrowed the money from the devious Nils Krogstad. And this, of course, was at a time when a woman couldn't borrow money without either her husband or her father's written permission. So, as she doesn't want Torvald to know, later on she says it would have wounded his pride, she doesn't in the end get her father's help. She takes out the loan and she forges her father's signature. Now, around the same time her father dies, and it turns out that the IOU that she's provided to Krogstad is actually dated a few days after her father's death. Now, Nora has acted out of concern for her husband, wanting, amongst other things, to protect his pride. As she explains to her old friend from childhood, Mrs. Lind, she says, "Torvald is a man with a great deal of pride. It would be terribly embarrassing and humiliating for him if he thought he owed anything to me. It would spoil everything between us. This happy home of ours would never be the same again." Now, Mrs. Lind has come to town in search of work and hopes that Torvald, now manager in the bank, will find her a position. She accuses Nora of having acted very rashly when she hears about the loan, and Nora replies, "Is it rash to save your husband's life?" Nora, we also learn, has taken on little jobs on the side to earn extra money, and again, of course, secretly. And she tells Mrs. Lind, and I quote, "Last winter, I was lucky enough to get quite a bit of copying to do. So I shut myself up every night and sat and wrote through to the small hours of the morning. Oh, sometimes I was so tired. But it was tremendous fun all the same, sitting there working and earning money. It was almost like being a man." Mrs. Lind is widowed and without resources, and Torvald does indeed find a position for her. But this means that Krogstad, the moneylender, is passed over. And it's for this reason that he sets out to blackmail Nora, threatening to tell her husband everything about the loan she's taken out and the fact that she forged a document and that has therefore committed a crime, unless she persuades her husband to give him some sort of position in the bank. But despite her best efforts, she flirts with her husband, she plays the little girl, she tries all manner of ruses, but he absolutely refuses to give this man a job because he considers him to be corrupt. And when Torvald finally learns about the loan that Nora has secured without his consent, he reacts with furious outrage and rejects her, primarily out of concern for his own social reputation, which he calls his honour. Nora implies that she will take her own life and says, "When I've left this world behind, you will be free." To which Torvald answers, "What good would it do me if you left this world behind, as you put it? Not the slightest bit of good." And here we see just how much what matters to him is his reputation. And his decision is that they should continue to live together but maintain appearances. And he says, "As far as you and I are concerned, things must appear to go on exactly as before, but only in the eyes of the world, of course. In other words, you'll go on living here, that's understood, but you will not be allowed to bring up the children. I can't trust you with them." Now, in the event, Krogstad, for various reasons, returns the IOU, and when Torvald takes it from a letter from Krogstad, he announces to Nora, "I am saved." Nora, on the other hand, now realizes that Torvald has never really loved her. Their marriage has been play acting for the sake of appearances, and she says, "You don't understand me, and I have never understood you until tonight. No, don't interrupt. I just want you to listen to what I have to say. We're going to have things out, Torvald." And she goes on to say, "Our house has never been anything but a playroom. I have been your doll wife, and the children in turn have been my dolls. I thought it was fun when you came and played with me, just as they thought it was fun when I went and played with them. That's been our marriage, Torvald." And he replies, "There is some truth in what you say, exaggerated and hysterical though it is, but from now on it will be different. Playtime is over. Now comes the time for lessons, both yours and the children's." Nora reminds Torvald that earlier he'd said that she wasn't fit to bring up the children. He protests that he said that in the heat of the moment, but Nora replies, "On the contrary, you were quite right. I'm not up to it. There's another problem that needs solving first. I must take steps to educate myself. You are not the man to help me there. That's something I must do on my own. That's why I'm leaving you." And Torvald replies, "You are out of your mind. I won't let you. I forbid you." And a little later he says, "Don't you care what people will say?" And then, "Isn't it your duty to your husband and to your children?" And Nora replies, "I have another duty, equally sacred, my duty to myself." Later in their exchange, Torvald says, "I would gladly toil day and night for you, Nora, enduring all manner of sorrow and distress, but nobody sacrifices his honor for the one he loves." And Nora replies, "Hundreds and thousands of women have." And Torvald claims, "But you're my wife, whatever you are." And Nora calmly replies, "From what I've heard, when a wife leaves her husband's house, as I am doing now, he is absolved by law of all responsibility for her. I can at any rate free you from all responsibility. You must not feel in any way bound, any more than I shall. There must be freedom on both sides. Look, here's your ring. Give me mine." Now, contemporary audiences, not surprisingly, were scandalized by the play, particularly at Ibsen's refusal to give the play a happy ending, except for that one German translation. The contemporary convention was very much for theatre to be an entertainment, and the happy ending meant that you left the theatre feeling buoyed up. And Nora's decision to leave not just her husband, but her husband and her children was seen as a dangerous example that other women might think to emulate. But Ibsen's interest was not in the happy denouement. He was interested in the question of the individual and the individual's need for self-knowledge and self-determination. Torvald, who regards himself as setting the moral standard, emerges as a self-interested hypocrite, and Nora turns out to be a childish idealist, and in some senses a destructive one. So what was it that Ibsen brought to the theatre, apart from scandal? And what does his contribution tell us about the fundamental nature of theatre as a genre? What can theatre do that other genres can't do? Why is it such a powerful and potentially disruptive social and cultural force? Well, in his wonderful set of essays, The Empty Space, Peter Brook, the well-known theatre and film director, sets out to answer some of these questions, not in relation to Ibsen, but in relation to other playwrights. And he singles out the remarkable contribution made by the French director and actor Antoine Artaud, about whom I wrote in one of my books a couple of years ago. Brook writes about him, railing against the sterility of the theatre before the war in France. An illuminated genius, Antoine Artaud, wrote tracts describing from his imagination and intuition another theatre, in other words, another kind of theatre, a wholly new conception of theatre, in which the blazing centre speaks through those forms closest to it, a theatre working like the plague, by intoxication, by infection, by analogy, by magic, a theatre in which the play, the event itself, stands in place of a text. Now, Ibsen's theatrical alchemy, more than half a century earlier, was, I think, very similar. So far, we've been thinking about, or I've been speaking about Ibsen's play as a play, in other words, essentially as a text, which is a fixed document. But a play is not theatre. And what I'd like to do now is to explore the theatrical potential of The Doll's House and to tease out how the idea of individualism is conveyed not simply as a theme in the play, in other words, a theme in the written text, but through myriad theatrical techniques which theatre offers. And also because individualism is also embedded in the individual actors, so the real people, who have to wrestle with the extraordinarily difficult role of Nora. And we'll hear from some of those actors in a moment. So Brooke says of Artaud's work, and I'll just repeat this, it is a theatre in which the play, the event itself, stands in place of a text. And Brooke also points out, and I quote, "The one thing that distinguishes the theatre from all other arts is that it has no permanence. The one thing that distinguishes the theatre from all the other arts is that it has no permanence." So you have the play, you have the text, which is fixed and permanent. But theatre is a performance, and every performance is different. You can say every production is different, well, that's obvious. But actually, every time the performance takes place, there are going to be some differences. And in that sense, it has no permanence. So, to explore the theatricality of Ibsen's play, we have to fall back on audio recordings, which is obviously very unsatisfactory. It's a travesty, really, of theatre, given its impermanence, that we're now going to look at something made permanent by film. And I don't see what else we can do, because we can't actually put on a performance this evening, although the cast is relatively small, so if there were volunteers, we could go about this in the proper way, but we probably don't have time. Theatre, as well as being ephemeral, of course, is a collaborative event. A whole range of people have to work together to make the event happen. There's the playwright, there is the particular crew that decides to take the play on, and of course there are financial considerations, commercial considerations about that. There's a producer, there are all manner of engineers, lighting engineers, sound engineers, costume designers, and so on. And that group of people has to work on the basis of the text to create this extraordinary event. Now, myriad choices, therefore, have to be made by a large number of people. And what I'd like to do now is to show some clips from various performances of the play and to ask what works best in relation to a number of aspects of Ibsen's text. Now, a key aspect, I think, of The Doll's House is the ways in which the play suggests Nora's entrapment. Nora is physically and metaphorically, emotionally, psychologically trapped. And this entrapment prevents her very much from being an individual. She is a wife and mother, and she is trapped in their home. And one of the ways that this is conveyed is that Nora never leaves the stage throughout the entire performance, and it's about 2 hours, 40 minutes, which makes it an incredibly demanding role for the lead woman. So she's there on the stage, she's watched by us, she's seen, she has no privacy, and she has no time, in a sense, to be herself. She's always responding to those who are watching her. There's nowhere for her to escape, there's nowhere for her to hide for long enough to enjoy a macaroon without fear of being caught. So the set must suggest claustrophobia. She's trapped in the drama. Torvald's study, on the other hand, from which he emerges from time to time, is a symbol of his importance, his authority, and it also allows him a privacy that Nora lacks. She has no room of her own, as Virginia Woolf famously entitled one of her essays. And that essay was based on a series of lectures, but that essay by Virginia Woolf was very much about the need for women to find their individualism as writers of fiction, and she thought this required a room of their own. Now, at one point, Nora tells her old friend about the hard times she's had earlier in her marriage and how she worked secretly to make some money. And I quoted that earlier. I shut myself up at night and sat and wrote through the small hours, sitting there and earning money like that. It was almost like being a man. Well, we weren't told where she shut herself up, but the idea of having a space in which to be alone and in private is very much underlined here. So what do we make of the staging of the young Vic's production, in which, as you saw, a revolving stage was used? Firstly, it means that the audience actually has access to different spaces in the apartment. The stage revolves, and we get to see into Torvald's study, and Nora actually has a bedroom, and we not only see the bedroom, we see her in it at various points in the production. She has a room of her own, to refer back to Virginia Woolf's notion. And I think this runs really counter to this important emphasis on the idea of entrapment in a place where Nora is always seen. On the other hand, I think the constant movement of the stage does suggest a wonderful restlessness, and one of the things that characterizes Nora, she has this childish restlessness. And also the kind of relentless passing of time, because we know that we're hurtling towards tragedy. And so I think the spinning of the stage does have a part to play in Ibsen's conception of it. One reviewer actually complained he started to feel slightly car-sick. I think that was a bit unkind. I think Nora's only sort of half understood sexual energy because she's not really aware of her own sexual energy. But again, I think the spinning stage adds to that. But it could be that this idea of entrapment is actually better represented using a much more conventional staging, and this is an amateur version in the round.
Hide the Christmas tree carefully, Helen. The children mustn't see it until this evening when it is dressed. Yes, ma'am.
Is that my little skylark twittering in there?
Yes, it is.
Is that my squirrel bustling about?
Yes.
When did my squirrel get home?
Just now. Torvald, come in here and see the things I have bought.
Don't disturb me. Bought, did you say? All of these things? Has my little spendthrift been wasting money again?
Yes, but this year we may spend a bit more than usual. This is the first Christmas we have not needed to economize.
Still, you know we can't spend money recklessly.
Yes, but this year we may be a bit more reckless, mayn't we? Just a tiny wee bit. You are soon going to have a big salary and earn lots of commissions.
Yes, but not until the new quarter. Then it'll be until the new year, until the salary is due.
So we can borrow till then.
Nora, the same little featherhead. Suppose now that I borrowed $100 that you spend it all on the Christmas week, and on New Year's Eve a slate fell on my head and killed me.
Oh, don't say such horrible things.
Still, suppose that happened. What then?
Well, if that should happen, I don't suppose I should care whether I owed money or not.
Yes, but what about those who had lent it?
Who they? Well, who should bother about them? I should not know who they were.
That is like a woman. But seriously, Nora, you know what I think about that? No debt, no borrowing. There can be no freedom or beauty about a home life that depends on borrowing and debt. We two have kept bravely on the straight road thus far and will continue to do so as long as there need be any struggle.
As you please, Torvald.
Come, come. That little skylark must not droop her wings. What do you think I've got here?
Money?
Don't you think I know what an awful lot is wanted for housekeeping at Christmas time?
$15? Thank you, Torvald. This will keep me going for a long time.
Indeed it must.
Of course it shall. But come here and see the things that I have bought, and all so cheap. I've gotten a new suit for Ivar, and a sword, and there's a new sled for Bob, and a doll for Emmy.
So there, I think we get a very good sense that Nora is always centre stage. She's always being watched. She has absolutely no privacy. And because it's in the round, the audience on one side can actually see the other side where the other half of the audience, or part of the audience, is also watching. So I think there's big difference in the way these two productions were staged. In a recent Irish production, Nora's childish energy and restlessness, I think, was foregrounded very well. We'll just... So, I mean, obviously there are versions that are much more modern in their staging, and that has a wonderful kind of life about it. And I think her silliness, which is one of the important parts of her character, is very well conveyed. On the other hand, in this same production, Torvald was shown to be, in many ways, equally childish.
You're just about to have a big salary and earn lots and lots of money.
I don't get paid for 3 books.
Can you not just borrow until then?
So again, it's rather delightful, but I really do think it runs counter to Ibsen's intention, which is for there to be this clear contrast between Torvald as the oppressive, repressive character and Nora as this rather ditzy female character. One of the most fundamental aspects, and one of the most important aspects, I think, of Ibsen's dramaturgy, prevents us from escaping wholly into the drama. And the German playwright Brecht, some decades later, used a term in an essay about theatre, Verfremdungseffekt, which is usually translated as alienation technique. And this was in 1936, and Brecht was writing a very political drama. He wanted his audience to think about the kinds of questions that he was posing in his plays. And in order to do this, he ensured that the audience was never really absorbed in the drama. In other words, the audience was always aware that they were watching a play, which I think in the Belhaven production is very obvious. Now, in Ibsen's play, Nora at one point dresses up to go to a Christmas party, and she's going to dance a tarantella, and she's dressed in effect like a doll. And this reminds us that we're watching actors on the stage putting on costumes, dressing up, that we are watching theatre. This isn't real life. And Nora, still a young woman, also dresses up to use her body and her sexuality and her eroticism as a kind of currency, which her husband is very pleased about. It comes across very well in the next clip, if we could have it from the Young Vic production. So what you would have seen was Torvald and Nora coming in from the Christmas party, and she is dressed in this extraordinary red, very bright red, very sexy dress. They're both slightly drunk, and he's delighted at how well she's performed and how everyone has been so taken by her, and so on. But we're very aware that this is about dressing up. This is about how you can put on different clothes and be somebody. You know, all of life is actually theatre. And that, I think this is very similar to Brecht's idea, but Brecht, of course, came some decades later. The other thing, of course, about the stage is that it does allow for a clear distinction between the seen and the unseen. It's one of the things that theatre as a genre can manipulate, the visible and the hidden. That works very well with the revolving stage. And when Torvald explains why he's not going to give Krogstad a job, he instills terror in Nora by saying, and I quote, "A man with things like that on his conscience will always have to lie and cheat and dissemble. He can never drop the mask," another reference to the idea of theatre and the hidden, "not even with his own wife and children." And he goes on to say, "A fog of lies like that in a household, it spreads disease and infection to every part of it. Every breath the children take in that kind of house is reeking with evil germs." And here there's a kind of conflation of the immoral with the pathological, of ethics and disease, the invisibility of moral decay and the invisibility of pathogens. And similarly, Torvald can't bear the sight of Nora's mending being left out in the apartment. And at one point he asks her to ask the maid to clear it away. It symbolises the broken, the imperfect, the neglected, the abused, the worn out, and it mustn't be seen. The mending must be taken out. But the central themes of the play are about dependency and independence, repression and freedom, duty and self-knowledge, and all this culminates in the agonizing closing scene. So now to consider what some actors, actresses have written about what it's like to play this extraordinarily demanding role. One of the earliest to be, I think, highly articulate about what this experience was like was Claire Bloom. She was born in 1931, and she was in some of the Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin's. But she also played Nora on Broadway in 1971, and then went on tour and did a film version and became very, very overwhelmed, in a sense, at one, she said, with Nora. And in her first autobiography, she wrote, "In that character was my two halves, the frivolous, silly, childish woman and the stern woman. I wouldn't say I learned anything from playing Nora, rather I assimilated all my experience as a woman and brought it together as an actress." And I think that this is what makes it such a demanding role, because the actor or actress has to assimilate her experience as a woman and bring all this together as an actress. And so I'd like to show 3 clips of interviews with 2 famous Noras. The first played by Janet McTeer, and the second the Hattie Morahan that you've already seen something of. So this is the Janet McTeer in an interview.
You wrote an amazing review.
He did.
But he cottoned onto the thing, you know, like a couple of the things said, you know, she's over the top. But she is. That's the whole point about the character I'd made, is that she's, you know, that she's, I've created somebody who's acting.
Yeah.
And doesn't realise she's doing it.
I want to get into
caught out.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that.
So basically, my whole take on it was that if you don't look at it as a feminist drama and look at it as a humanist drama with possibly feminist, you can draw feminist conclusions from it, then what you have is somebody who, a much more flawed person, a much more flawed character, a much more flawed relationship. And that stuff at the end, it's all there. It's brilliantly written, I think. And, you know, when as soon as she says, "I don't love you," she then says, "I'm terribly sorry, it hurts me to say it." I mean, she's full of doubt. And I just thought that, you know, that's what happens when real couples break up. It doesn't matter if you think you're right or know you're right or whatever. Even as you're walking out the door, there's a part of you that's going,
hurt and saying, what am I doing?
Done? And you're terrifyingly lonely, terrifyingly whatever, and, you know, you always wish it could just be better just for a minute, and it's...
Then 2 clips of Hattie Morahan, who got an Oscar for her Nora. So these are 2 interviews with Hattie.
I've never come across a part, I think, where we literally have to see, for a woman to see the character turn on a sixpence.
On a sixpence.
Yeah, well, and transform. I mean, it's turn on a dime. It's a fascinating thing to inhabit, a journey to inhabit, because she remains on stage and different characters come in one after the other and we see her transform before her eyes. And you're thinking, who is this woman? Why is she so manipulative to this person? Why is she suddenly behaving like this and playing this game? And, you know, one moment she's best friends with this person, the next moment she's, you know, doing her down in public. And she's a sort of a cocktail of psychological... God, I don't know how to describe it, but it's because she has no conventional power or, you know, legitimate power, the only means she has to control her life is through playing other people, and she's a sort of expert. She's like, it's like playing.
Did you?
I had to sort of utterly rewire how she, to get into her, I suppose, her fundamental lack of self-worth, that she's been groomed from birth to believe that the most important thing is to be beautiful, to please men, to be attractive, to be entertaining, to be charming, that using her intelligence is unattractive and wrong, using her mind, using, you know, interfering, using her judgment, any of that. So she has an utterly kind of distorted sense of herself. And then from there, you discover that what she essentially has done for her whole life is be whatever an individual person needs her to be.
So I think in some sense, I think what both these actors are saying is that you have as Nora both to play a part, but also to be themselves as they play that part. All their experience as individual women, as we've heard, has to be brought to bear on the character. And for a 19th century male playwright in Norway to have written a play that was first performed in 1879 that requires that of the women who play Nora, I think is a remarkable achievement. And there'll be many more Noras. Thank you.